In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural white birch tree bark material in Blender. And then after we create the procedural material, I'm going to show you how to join it together into this custom node group. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material, and then we also have color 1 and also color 2. Then we have the dot scale to change the size of those little dots on the tree bark. And then we also have the dots color. Then we can also change the roughness in the material. Then we also have the patches scale, and this will just change the size of those little dark areas on the bark. And then we also have the patches amount, so if you want lots of patches you can turn this way down, or you can turn it up if you want very little patches and you just want to see more of the white bark. Then we also have the patches detail, so I can turn that up or down, and then I also have the patches distortion, and I actually think turning up the distortion to just a small amount looks pretty good, maybe turning it up to like a 1. And then we also have 4 different bump strengths, so we have the patches bump strength, we also have the creases bump strength, so those little lines going back and forth, then we also have the dots bump strength, and then we also have the noise bump strength to change the noise of the entire material. And then we have some displacement settings, so we have the noise displacement scale, and then finally we have the displacement strength. If you'd like to help support this channel and purchase this material, then you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And you can also check out my procedural material packs to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, then you can check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And I also have a different procedural tree bark material, so if you'd like to check out that other procedural tree bark tutorial, I'll have the link in the description to that as well. So let me just show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added an icosphere. And then right behind me, if you click on the little add icosphere settings, just open this up, I'm going to turn the subdivisions up to 6, and that way we have a very nice smooth even sphere. And I want this icosphere to have a lot of geometry and to be very smooth because we're going to be adding the displacements to make the edges kind of popping out. And then in object mode, using the object context menu, I'm going to shade this object smooth, and then I can bring it over here to the side. I'm also going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go here to Mesh, and I want to add a cylinder because I want to preview what this material would look like if it was on a tree trunk object. And after you add the cylinder, I'm going to go into edit mode, and then I'm going to scale the cylinder up on the Z-axis, and I'll just make it a bit taller, so something like that. And then if you click up here on the face select, I'm going to select the top face and also the bottom face, and I'll hit X, and then I just want to delete the faces. And then just like the icosphere has lots of geometry, I want to add lots of geometry to the cylinder so that the displacements have more detail to use. So I'm going to press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and then I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel, and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel until the faces are about an even size. And then I can left click and then right click so they stay in the center. So I want these to be about the size of a square, and that is going to be close enough. In this way, the displacements will have more even detail. And then I can go back to object mode with the tab key, and then using the object context menu, I'm going to shade the object smooth. Then I'm just going to scale this object way down so that it is about the same size as the icosphere, and I can bring it over here. Now when modeling objects to the real life scale in Blender, the default primitive objects are a little bit higher than an average human, so these objects are quite large. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key and select both objects, and then I'm going to scale the objects, and I'm going to type in 0.35 and then enter. So just scale it down by 0.35. So now this cylinder object is much closer to the size of a tree trunk. And I'll also press Ctrl A, and I'm going to apply the scale of these objects, and this way this is now the object's new default size. Then I also added a camera here, and I just pointed the camera at the object. Now if you select the camera and go over here to the side panel, you can click on the camera settings, and I turn the focal length up to 80, and this way it just kind of zooms the camera in and makes everything look a bit more flat, and I do like that a bit better. Now for the lighting, I added this area light right here, so you can press Shift A, and you can go down here to light, and then you can just add an area light. And I just scaled the area light up and then pointed it here on the side of the objects. And then if you click on the area light right over here on the settings, I turn the power to 100, mode so it's a bit brighter. So this is going to give us some nice lighting shining on the side of the objects. And then to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, you can go over here to the world properties, and I added in this Machine Shop 02 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Link will be in the description if you'd like to download it. And again, I downloaded the 1K HDR version of this HDRI. So once you download the HDRI, you can add a new world if you don't already have a new world. And then right here on the surface, on the color here, you can click on the yellow dot and then you can choose environment texture. And then you can click on the open button and open up the downloaded HDRI. And then here on the strength of the HDRI, I wanted it to be a little bit less bright, so I turned the strength to 0.8. And then if you don't want to see the HDRI in the background, if you just want to make the background transparent, you can click right up here on the render properties and you can open up the film tab and then you can just check mark the transparent button. And that way it's not quite as distracting, so the background is just transparent. And then to make the colors look a little bit nicer, here on the color management, you can set the view transform to filmic and also the look here to high contrast. Now I am going to be using the material displacements to actually make the tree bark popping in and out. And so if you want to use the material displacements, then you will need to be using the Cycles rendering engine because Eevee doesn't support material displacements. So make sure that you're using Cycles. And then I want to give these objects even more geometry so the displacements have more detail to work with. So I'm going to click on the cylinder object here and I'm going to go over here to the modifier properties and you can click on add modifier and you can add this subdivision surface modifier. And here on the subsurf modifier, I turn the levels of viewport and render both up to 2, and that way it'll give the material even more geometry to work with. And then you can do the same thing for the icosphere. So if you click on the icosphere, you can click on add modifier and you can add the subdivision surface modifier, but then this object is already pretty detailed, so I'm just turning the levels of viewport and render just up to 1. Alright, so I've deleted the material and I'm in the shading workspace. So I have the 3D viewport right over here and I'm in the rendered mode, and then I have the shader editor right over here. So I can click on the new button to add a new material, and then I can just rename this material. And I will rename it to white birch tree bark. And then I can also click and drag right here on the material, and I can drop the material onto this object as well. So they both have the same material. Now, because we're going to be using the displacements, we need to tell this material that it can use the displacements. So we need to click right here on the material properties, and we need to scroll way down here and open up the settings. And then under surface, we have this displacement setting, and we want to change it to displacement and bump. This way it's telling the material that it can use the displacements. And then also before we start, I will be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, then you can click here on edit and you can go here to the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and you can check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. And I'll show you how to use it in the video. So to start off, I'm going to create the main texture for the tree bark. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop it down here, and then using the feature of the Node Wrangler, you can hold down the Control and Shift key, and you can select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object. So just Control Shift and select the noise texture so that we can preview it. And also with the noise texture selected, I will press Control T, and that will add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Now I want to use the object coordinates because if you look here on the texture, you can see it actually does look a little bit stretched. So I'm going to take the object and let's put that into the vector of the mapping. And by using the object coordinates, it's going to place the texture on the objects more evenly. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I want to turn the scale up just a little bit, so I will turn the scale up to 6. And then I want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then I do want to add just a little bit more roughness because it gives it a bit more detail. So I'm going to turn this roughness value to a 0.55. And then I also think adding a tiny little bit of distortion makes it look a bit nicer. So I'm going to turn the distortion to just a 0.2. Now this texture is pretty grayed out and it's not very contrasty. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search and I'm going to search for a color ramp and let's put that here after the noise texture. And I can click and drag to box select the nodes and bring them back a bit. So I can now drag these tabs around and that's going to make the texture more contrasty. So you can see if I drag these really close, it's very contrasty and sharp. So I'm going to drag the white tab to about here, and then I'm also going to drag the black tab over to about here. And then I want to have kind of a mid-gray color, so it's not going from white all the way to black really quickly, so that's kind of a bit of gray. So I'm going to hold down the Control key and then click right here in the middle to add another tab. And then if I click here on the color, I'm just going to make this color here in the middle kind of like a mid-gray color. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using for this mid-gray color, then you can go to the hex value and you can punch in a hex value of 5C 5C, 5C, 5C. And then you can just kind of play around with this, and I just want a bit of a mid-gray color, and that way there's going to be a nice transition between the white bark and then the brown bark. Now this really isn't looking like the texture of tree bark, and so what I'm going to do is squash down the noise texture. We're going to scale it down on the z-axis so that it looks more like a tree bark texture. So I'm just going to select this mapping node, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here after the first one. Now why I want two mapping nodes is because this mapping node is going to change the overall scale of the material. So this mapping and texture coordinate, we're not going to play around with these values. So I can actually just drag them down here. And this scale will be connected up to all the textures, so we can use this scale to change the entire size of the material. But then this mapping node, we can scale it on the z-axis, and that way it'll squish this texture down. So I'm just going to turn up the z value, and you can see we're going to squish down the texture. So I'm going to turn this value to a 4.7, and now it is looking quite a bit more like tree bark because it is squished down. Now I want to keep my nodes nicely organized, so I'm going to click and drag to box select all these nodes, and I can press Ctrl J. Ctrl J is going to join them together into a frame, and so now I can drag the frame around. And if I select the frame, I can press F2, and that's going to add a node label, and I'm going to call this Patches Texture. I can also click and drag just to box select these nodes, and I can press Ctrl J to join it together into a frame, and with the frame selected, I can press F2, and I can just rename this to Mapping. So I now want to create a new texture setup down here, and this is going to be those little creases which are going back and forth. And this node setup up here is pretty similar to the other node setup that we're going to be creating. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all the patches textures, and then I'm going to press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D is going to duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. And so we want all the textures to be going into this mapping because the mapping will change the size of the entire material. So I can now Control Shift and select this color ramp to preview it. And if I click here to select the frame, I'm going to press F2 to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to Creases Texture. Now I want to reset all these nodes to their default values. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select just these three nodes here. And I can hit the backspace, and that's going to reset all the nodes back to their default values. So now let's change the noise texture settings. So for this one, I'm going to turn the scale up to 7, but then I also want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way up to 15. And then on the roughness here, I will turn this to a 0.55. And then here on the distortion, I just want to add a little bit of distortion, so I'll turn the distortion to a 0.7. So I want to make this texture more contrasty as well. So here on the color ramp, I can drag these values out, and as I drag them together, it's going to be more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the black tab over here and the white tab to about there. And then I also want to change the mapping because I want to squish this down, and I want to squish this down quite a lot so it just looks like little lines going back and forth. So on the scale here, on the scale Z, I'm going to turn this all the way up to 16. This way it looks like just a bunch of little lines which are going back and forth. And that's a really cool texture that we can add to the bark. So I now want to navigate right up here, and I want to add another group of textures, which is going to be the little dots on the bark. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a Voronoi texture, and let's just drop the Voronoi up here. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. And you can see that this Voronoi texture has a bunch of little dots. Now you can see that it's a bit stretched, so again I want to take the mapping, and let's put the vector into the vector of the Voronoi, and that way it'll use the object coordinates. And then here on the Voronoi, I can turn the scale down so we can see many more of the dots. And I'm going to turn the Voronoi scale to 120. Now if you zoom in closely, you can see the dots are very smooth, and so I want to distort them a little bit so they look a bit more organic and natural. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's put this noise texture between the mapping and the Voronoi. And because it's going through the vector, the noise texture is distorting the placement of the Voronoi. So now you can see it looks all warped. And then let's also change some of the noise texture settings. So I'll turn the scale up to like a 30, and then I also want to turn the detail here to the max of 15 so it's very detailed. Now this doesn't really look like dots. You can see the dots, but they're super distorted, and so I want to have the noise texture have less of an effect over the Voronoi texture. So let's press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix node, and let's drop the mix node up here, and I want to click on the float, and I want to change it to color instead. And then we can drop the mix node here in between the noise texture and the Voronoi. So I now want to mix this noise texture with the original mapping, which isn't distorted at all. So I can take the vector of this mapping and I want to put that into color A of the mix here. And then I want to take the noise texture color and I want to put that into color B. Now you can see that this wire here is overlapping over some of the other nodes. So what I'm going to do is just drag the mix up here, and then you can see there's these two wires, so it's going into the noise and the mix. So I'm going to hold down the shift key, and then I can right click and drag over these two wires and let go, and that's going to add a reroute, and I can drag the reroute up here, and that way the wires are not overlapping. So then back here on the mix, you can see there's the factor, and the factor is going to blend between using color A and using color B. So if I drag the factor all the way to 0, it's not distorting the texture at all, but then as I turn the factor up, it's distorting it more and more. Now you can see it's moving the texture around a lot, so I'm going to click on this mix here, and I'm going to change it to linear light, and this way the texture isn't being moved around quite as much. You can see I drag this around, and you can see it's just distorting it, but it's not moving it around. So I want this factor to be very subtle, because I only want it to distort the Voronoi a very small amount. So here on the factor, I'm going to turn this to a 0.013. So just a 0.013. And now if you zoom in here, you can definitely see those dots, but they're just being distorted a little bit, so they just look a bit more noisy. And that way they look more organic and natural. Now these dots are way too big, and so I do want to make them more contrasty. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the Voronoi texture. And then I can drag these two tabs together, and that'll make it more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the black tab out a little bit, and then I will drag the white tab way over here, and that way we now have a texture with all these little dots, but most of the texture is white. So all of these nodes here are the textures for the dots. So I'm going to click and drag to box select these nodes. I can press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and then I can kind of squish them together just so that they're a bit more organized. And then click on the frame. You can press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to dots texture. And then I do want to make one more small group of textures, and that's going to be some overall noise over the entire material. So I'm going to drag the dots texture up here, and then here in the middle I can press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for a noise texture. Let's drop this here, and then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then again, we want to take the mapping here. Let's take the vector and put that into the vector of the noise texture so that it is placed more evenly on the objects. And then let's change the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale here on the noise texture just to 6, and then I want to turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then I want to make this just a little bit more contrasty, so I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after the noise texture. And then I can drag the black tab over. I'm just going to drag it over a little bit so it's a little bit darker. And then if I click here on the white tab, I can click on the color, and I'm just going to make this a tiny bit darker so you can see it a little bit better. And the slightly gray color that I'm going to be using on this color ramp is going to be a hex value of E5, E5, E5. So you can punch that into the hex value if you want to use the same color that I'm using. So I'm going to drag this back just so that the wire isn't overlapping, and I can select both of these nodes, and I can press Ctrl J to join them into a frame, and if I select the frame, I'll add a label by pressing F2, and I can rename this to noise texture. So we now have these 4 groups of textures, and I want to join them together. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix node. Let's drop this here, and then we're mixing color values together, so let's click on the float, and I can change this to color instead. So here on this noise texture color ramp, I'm going to take the color and I'm going to put that into color B, and then we're going to take the patches texture here. Let's take this color and I can put it into color A, and then I can Control Shift and select this node to preview it. And then I just want to add the dark values, because if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, you can see that as dark there, and then if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, what we want to see is the dark values. So I just want to add the dark values together. So if I Control Shift and select the mix, I can click on the mix here, and I want to change it to darken instead. So this way, as I turn the factor up, it's just going to add the dark values of the noise texture. So I'll turn the factor all the way up to 1, so we're just mixing the dark areas together. Now the problem with this texture is that it is just white and black, and I instead want these dark areas to be a bit brown. And because I'm joining this together into a node group, I don't just want to change these colors here on the color ramp because those color ramps are harder to control outside of a node group. So what I'm going to do is just select this darken. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it right here. And then let's click on the darken, and I can change it back to mix. So I can now take the result here, the result from the darken, and I'm going to put that into the factor. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So because the darken result is going into the factor, that's going to control where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B. So here on color B, I'm going to click on the color and I'm going to make this fully white, and that's going to be the light color. And then here on color A, I'm going to make this a very strong orange color, and I'm going to make it a bit darker. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using for the dark brown color, if you click on the color and then go to the hex, you can punch in 231811. But we still have two more textures that we need to add in, and that is the dots texture and also the creases texture. So to do that, I can select this mix and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it here. And let's click on the type here, and I want to change this back to darken. And then I want to take the mix result here and I want to put that into color A. And then I can Control Shift and select the darken to preview it, and I'll just stick it down here. So I'm now going to be mixing in the creases texture. So let's take the color ramp from the creases. I'm going to bring out a wire and stick this here into color B of the darken. And because I have set this to darken, it's only going to add the dark values. So it's basically just taking the dark values from the creases texture and it's sticking it on top here of the other texture. And then the factor is controlling how much it's adding. Now I don't want to make the creases fully visible, so I'm going to turn the factor to just a 0.5, and that way they're just kind of like a gray color. So we now have one more texture that I want to mix in, and that is going to be the dots texture. So let's click on this darken here, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it. Let's drop it up here, and then I actually want to click on the darken here, change the type, and I want to turn this back to mix. And then I want to take the darken result and I want to put that into color B. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it, and let's just drag it down here. So I want to be able to control the color of the dots in the custom node group. So I'm going to take the dots texture, let's take the color ramp, and I'm going to bring out a wire here and I'm going to stick this into the factor. So again, the factor is controlling where it's going to be A and where it's going to be B, and we've taken the main texture here that we've added all the textures together and we've put that into B. So now here on A, that is going to be the color of the dots. Now I want to leave this at this dark color, and if it is a different color, if you changed it, then what you can do is go here to color A on this mix, and you can drag the color and you can drop it here into color A because I want it to be the same color. But you can see if I change this color, that is now going to change the color of those dots, but I'm going to leave it at that dark color. And then I want to click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'm going to drag them back, and this is the final base color, so I can take the mix result and let's put that into the base color of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now I also want a little bit of variation in the roughness so that some parts are more rough and other parts are more shiny. So let's take the mix result and I can put that into the roughness, but you can see it's very shiny, so to control that better, I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here in between the mix and the principled shader. So here on the color ramp, I can click on the black color and I can make this lighter, and you can see it's going to be much more rough of a texture. So I'm just going to make this a very light gray color, and the hex value that I'm going to be using for this light gray color on the color ramp is going to be BF, BF, BF. Now when I join this together into a custom node group, I want to be able to control the amount of roughness. So what I can do is press Shift A, and I can go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a hue saturation value, and let's put that between the color ramp and the principled shader. So this value is going to make the texture lighter and darker, so we can add this into the custom node group to control the roughness. So we'll just leave that there for now. So I now want to add some data into the normal to give it some bump, because right now this texture is very smooth and it's not very bumpy. So I'll press Shift A, and I'm going to go here to the search, and I need to search for a bump node, and let's drop the bump node down here because we're going to use the bump node to turn the texture data into normal data that the shader can use. So the first bump that I want to add is the bump of the little patches texture. So I can take the patches texture here, let's take this color, and I'm going to stick it into the height value of the bump. And so this way it's going to convert it to normal data. So I can now take the normal and I can put that into the normal of the principled shader. And so now you can see it looks all bumpy there on the edges. And then you can change the strength, but I actually want it to be very strong. So I'm going to leave the strength at 1. And now you can see it looks all bumpy there on the edges of the patches. So the next one that I want to add is the creases, because I want the creases to look a little bit bumpy. So let's click on the bump node. I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after the first one. So the normal can go into the normal, and so we now have this extra height value that we can add more data into. So let's take the creases texture, I can take the color, and we're going to stick that into the height value of the bump. And so now you can see it looks all bumpy. Now I don't want it to be bumpy all over the place because this is super bumpy. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's click on the color ramp, and I can put it here in between the creases and this bump. So just stick it right here, and I can drag it over. Now if I click on the colors here and drag the colors together on the color ramp, that's going to make it more and more contrasty. So I'm going to drag this one to over here, and then the black tab I'm going to drag to over here. So now you can see it. There are some parts where it is smooth, because if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, it is much more contrasty. So then the kind of the transition between white and black, that is where it's going to look all bumpy. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now that is a bit too strong, so here on this bump node, I'm going to turn the strength way down to like a 0.3, so that way it is more subtle. But now we have another layer of bump. So I want to add another layer of bump, so let's click on this bump node, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after this one. And the next layer of bump that I want to add is the dots. So right up here, let's take the dots texture, let's take the color, and I can drag this down here and put it into the height of this bump. So now if I zoom in really closely, you can see the dots look like they're bumping back in. And I can turn the strength up if I want to make it stronger. And I'm going to turn this strength to like a 0.4, just so that those dots are a little bit more bumpy. So then I want to add one more layer of bump, because you can see there's a bunch of areas where the bark is very smooth. So I'm going to click on this bump, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after this one. And then the last one that I want to add is this noise texture. So let's take this color ramp color, I can bring out a wire, let's drag this over here, and I want to stick this into the last height value of this bump. And that way you can see there's just a little bit of noise over the entire material. And then I do want to make this a little bit less strong, so I'm going to turn the strength value to a 0.25, just a 0.25, so it's a bit more subtle. And now that is looking like tree bark. Now if you look here on the edges, you can see this material is very smooth, and we haven't added the displacement yet. So I'm now going to be adding a couple of textures and putting that into the displacement. So what I'm first going to do is just select this mix node right up here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it down here. I just want another mix node because I want to be able to mix two textures together, and then we'll put that into the displacement. So the two textures that I want to mix together are the noise and the patches. And the patches will kind of make the patchy areas go back in, and then the noise will just make it overall a little bit bumpy. So I'm going to go up here to this noise, and let's take the color, and I'm going to drag this way down here, and I'm going to put this into color A. And then let's go back up here, and here on the patches texture, let's take the color, and I'm going to bring this down and put it into color B. And then I can Control Shift and select this mix to preview it. Now I just want to add the dark values, so let's click on the mix here, and I want to change this to darken instead. So just change that to darken. And then here on the factor, you can see I can turn this up and down, and that's going to change how much of the patches it's using. And I just want to turn the factor to 0.5, and that way it's not quite as strong. Now you can see that these wires are overlapping, so just to keep my nodes nicely organized, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag and then let go, and also do the same thing for this one. Hold down the Shift key, right click and drag and let go, and then I can just drag these over here, and that way they're not going to be overlapping, so it just makes the node setup a bit more organized. And I can also drag the darken right over here, kind of underneath the principled shader. So we can now use this texture right here as the displacement texture. So let's take the result here, and I want to put this into the displacement of the material output. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. And then if the texture isn't being displaced like this, then you need to go right over here to the material properties, and here under the settings, as I talked about at the beginning of this video, you need to make sure that the surface displacement is set to displacement and bump. And then also, you need to go right up here to the render properties and make sure that you're using the Cycles rendering engine because Eevee doesn't support material displacements. Now something is definitely wrong here because you can see it's jutting off to the side and that doesn't look very realistic. And this is because this is color data, but then this is displacement data. So just like we did here with the bump nodes, we need a node which is going to convert the color data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node, and let's stick this here between the darken and the displacement. And I can just drag it down here. Now to convert it to displacement data, we actually want to take the result and we want to put that into the height value of the displacement. And now you can see it looks super jagged. So we can now change the scale to make it more subtle. So I'm going to turn the displacement scale to just a 0.05. I think a 0.05 is pretty good, so that way here on the edges it just looks a bit bumpy. And if I Control Shift and select the darken, you can see where the areas are darker, it's going to be going in more. So if I now Control Shift and select the principled shader, if I look here on the side, you can see where it is darker, it's now going in. And then where the areas are lighter, they're going to be popping out a bit more. If I Control Shift and select the principled shader, it's a bit lighter here, so you can see it is popping out. And if you want to make the patchy areas be going back in even more, you can turn the factor all the way up to 1, and that's going to make it darker, so it's going to push it back in. And then of course you can also change the scale to change the size of the displacement. And you can also drag around the mid-level. If you want to make the trunk a bit thinner, you can drag the mid-level down, or if you want to make it a bit thicker, you can drag the mid-level up. And that is it. So that is the procedural white birch tree bark material. So I'm now going to be joining this together into a custom node group. So I'm just going to click and drag just to box select all the nodes except the material output. And I can press Control G. Control G is going to join it together into a node group. And you can press the Tab key to go in and out of the node group. So I'll just press the Tab key to go out of the node group, and I can drag the material output over here, and I'm going to zoom in, and then I want to click on the node group and I want to drag it out, and then I want to rename the node group. So if I click right here on the material name, I can press Control C to copy the name. I can click here on the node group and press Control V to add the white tree bark material. And then with the node group selected, I'll hit the Tab key to go into the node group. And if you press the N key, that'll open up the side panel. And if you click here on group, you can see we have inputs and outputs. Now here on the outputs, I want to click on the BSDF and I want to double click on this to rename it. And I'm going to rename it to shader because I like that better. And I can also click on the arrow here just to bring it up. And that way outside of the node group, it's not going to be overlapping. So we have the shader first and then we have the displacement. So let's go back into the node group. So if I go right over here, you can see we have the group input, and so we can put values into the group input, and that way we'll be able to control those values outside of the node group. So I'm going to drag the group input right here and drag it into the mapping frame, and then this mapping node is plugged up to all of the textures. So we can use the scale value to change the entire size of the material. So let's take the scale and I can put that into the group input, and then if I click here on the scale, I don't want it to be a vector because if I tab to go outside of the node group, you can see we have 3 values, but I instead just want 1 value to change the entire size of the material. So back inside the node group here on the scale, I can click on the type here and I want to change it to float instead, and that way outside of the node group you can see it's just using 1 value. And then I want to click on the scale and I want to turn that back to 1, so that is the default scale. And also let's tab to go into the node group, and if you click here on the scale, we want to change this default value to 1 as well. So I now want to add all of the custom colors. So I can press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for another group input, and I'm going to drop it here. So these group inputs are actually the same, but I'm just duplicating it, and that way I can move the group input around. But the same data is going to be linked between these 2 group inputs. So I can drag this group input over here, I'm going to drag it down here, and then I want to take the 2 colors and put that in here. So I'll put color A into the extra socket here, and then color B, I can put that into the extra socket here. And then I can click on these to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to color 1, and then here I'm going to rename this to color 2. And then also right here on this mix, we have the dots color. So let's take A and I can stick that into the extra socket. And if I click on this to rename it, I can just rename it to dots color. So outside the node group, we have the different custom colors. Now I also want to add the roughness. So let's drag the group input right down here. And then over here, we have this hue saturation value, and this is going to change the roughness. So let's drag the value over here, put it into the extra socket. And if I click on this to rename this, I can just rename it to roughness. So I now want to add all of the different bump strengths. So I'm going to click on this group input and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I want to drop it down here. And then this first bump strength, that is going to change the patches. So let's take the strength, put that into the extra socket, and here I can double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to patches bump strength. And then here on the next one, this strength value, that's going to change the bump of the creases. So let's put the strength here under the extra socket, and I can click on this, and I'm going to rename it to creases bump strength. And then let's go to the next one here, and this one is going to change the dots. So let's put the strength here into the extra socket, and I can rename this one to dots bump strength. And then this last one over here, this is going to change the noise. So let's take the strength, put that into this one here, and I can rename this to a noise bump strength. And then I also want to add the displacement strength. So I'm going to click on this group input here. I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm just going to drag it right over here. And then I can take the scale and I can put that right here into the extra socket. And if you wanted to control the mid-level, then you could also stick it in there, but I'm not going to put the mid-level into the group input. I'm going to click right here to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to displacement strength. So I now want to be able to control a bunch of the different texture values. So I'm going to click on one of the group inputs, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drag it right up here, and I'm going to stick it behind these textures. So I want to be able to change the size of the patches. So we have this scale right here in the patches texture. So let's take the scale, I can put that into the extra socket, and I can rename this to patches scale. And then I also want to change the amount of patches, and if I change these color ramps around, that's going to change the size of the patches. So I can just make these colors lighter or darker to change the size of the patches. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I can search for the hue saturation value, and I want to put that in between the noise texture and the color ramp. So now we have the value of the hue saturation value, and if I drag this around, that's going to make it lighter or darker. So I can take the value of the hue saturation value, and I can stick this here into the extra socket, and then if I click right up here to rename this, I want to rename this to patches amount. And then I also want to be able to control the detail of the patches. So we have this detail level right here. So I can take the detail and let's stick this up here, and I can rename this to patches detail. But I do want to change the distortion because turning up the distortion can really change the look of the bark. So I want to put the distortion here into the extra socket, and I can rename this one to patches distortion. And then just a few more values that I want to add. So here on this noise texture, we have the scale. So let's put the scale here into the extra socket. And if I click on this to rename it, I'm going to rename it to noise displacement scale because it's actually changing the noise displacement. And I also want to change the dot scale. So we can take this Voronoi scale right here. Let's drag this over, and I can stick it into the extra socket, and I can rename this to dots scale. Now, if I go outside of the node group by hitting the tab key, I do want to reorganize this a bit better. So I'm going to go back into the node group. So I want to click on the dot scale, and I want to click on the arrows here, and I want to bring this all the way up above the dots color. I think that just looks a bit nicer. Then I will have the roughness right after that, but then I want to take all of these bumps here, so you can see there's these 4 bumps, and I want to put that almost at the very bottom, but above the displacements. So let's take the patches bump strength. I can click on the arrow and bring it all the way down here, and we can actually bring it all the way to the bottom. And then this creases bump strength, I can click on the arrow and bring that all the way down, and you can of course reorganize these however you want, but if you want to reorganize it like mine, let's bring all of the bumps down here, and then the last one, the noise bump strength, I can bring this all the way down here. So I now want both of the displacements to also be on the very bottom. So let's click on the noise displacement scale, and I can hit the arrow to bring this down, and then let's also click on the displacement strength, and I can click on the arrow and bring this all the way to the very bottom. So now we have the displacements at the bottom, then we have the 4 bumps, and then after that we have the different texture controls. So we have the patches, distortion, detail, amount, and scale. Then we also have the roughness here, and then we have the 2 custom settings for the dots. Then we have color 1 and color 2, and finally the overall scale. Now to make this look a little bit nicer, I want to collapse these node groups because you can see there's all these extra values. So you can just select all the group inputs by holding down the Shift key and selecting all of the group inputs. So I can now press Ctrl H, and that is going to collapse all of the group inputs, so they are much smaller. And I can just drag them over here just to make them look a bit nicer, maybe drag this down, bring this up here, and this one I can also drag it up there. So I can now hit the Tab key to go outside of the node group, and I can press the N key to close the side panel, and we can review the material. So now we have the overall scale, and we also have the different colors. So we have color 1 and color 2. We also have the dot scale, and then we also have the dots color. Then we also have the roughness, and then we have some pretty cool values here. So the patches scale, then we also have the amount of patches, we also have the patches detail, and then we also have the patches distortion. And then we have these 4 different bump strengths. And then finally we have the noise displacement scale. So if I want to make the noise smaller, I can. And then finally we have the displacement strength. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase the material, then you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And you can also check out my Procedural Material Packs if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, including my other procedural tree bark material, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. I'll also have a link in the description to the other tree bark material that I've created. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching.